History remembers Marcus Aurelius as the philosopher king, the Stoic sage who wrote of virtue and wisdom. But in the shadows of his reign, along the blood-soaked frontiers of the Danube, he waged wars of annihilation. Behind the marble busts and noble words lay winters of starvation, villages burned to ash, and betrayals paid for in severed heads. This is not the story Rome wants you to remember. This is the story of the emperor's wars, where mercy froze in the snow and entire peoples vanished without a trace. Chapter 1. Blood on the Eastern Sands. When the smoke of the East began to rise, it was not the gentle haze of trade caravans, but the black breath of war, for the Parthian king Vologases IV had chosen to test Rome's strength, striking deep into Armenia and Syria, seizing cities under the shadow of sudden attack, and forcing Marcus Aurelius, still newly burdened with the weight of the purple, to commit his legions to a brutal, distant theater that would bleed both Rome's treasury and its men. With Lucius Verus sent to nominally command, the real grind of the war fell to hardened generals who knew that no mercy would be shown on this front. And so the legions moved east like a slow tide of iron, crushing villages suspected of harboring Parthian scouts, cutting down every able-bodied man in their path, and leaving behind only silence and the carrion that feasted on it. For in these campaigns, Rome's discipline was matched only by its ruthlessness. Through winter and desert heat, they pushed forward, each mile taken at the cost of rotting corpses in the sun. And though Parthian forces were skilled horse archers who could melt into the horizon after deadly volleys, the Romans adapted, luring them into feigned retreats before surrounding and annihilating them, sparing no one, for the command was clear: no prisoners unless they could be paraded through Rome as trophies. By 163 AD, the legions had retaken Armenia, installing a puppet king loyal to Rome. But it was not enough. Marcus demanded the insult be repaid in full, so the war rolled on into the heart of Mesopotamia, where the rivers ran with blood and cities like Seleucia faced the horror of siege, its walls battered by Roman siege engines until the defenders, driven by starvation, turned on each other in desperate riots. When the gates fell, Rome's soldiers poured in, killing indiscriminately. Temples burned, treasures looted, and those who surrendered were often nailed to wooden beams as a warnings to others. For this was not a campaign of simple conquest, but one meant to remind the East of what defying Rome cost. Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, followed, stormed by their relentless legions whose torches lit the night with the glow of imperial vengeance. Its defenders cut down in the streets while the wealthy were dragged from hiding places, their screams swallowed by the roar of flames. Betrayal was never far from these sands, for some of Rome's eastern client kings, eager to hedge their loyalty, fed the Parthians intelligence in exchange for promises of gold. But when they were discovered, Marcus had them executed without trial, their bodies displayed along the main roads, so no ruler under Rome's shadow would doubt the fate of traitors. The deeper the Romans pushed, the more brutal the reprisals became, for resistance meant not just defeat but extermination. Villages that aided Parthian raiders were wiped from maps, their wells poisoned, their livestock slaughtered, and survivors sold in chains to the markets of Antioch. Yet, as the war reached its apparent peak of success, an invisible enemy slipped into the ranks. Disease, likely born from the plague-stricken Parthian lands, began to infect the legions, killing men faster than any arrow, turning victories into pyres as corpses were burned in heaps to keep the pestilence from spreading. Still, the war dragged on, for Marcus Aurelius understood that to leave before the Parthians were broken would invite another rebellion, and so the soldiers fought on under banners blackened by smoke, each skirmish a lesson in cruelty. Parthian deserters who tried to defect to Rome were often interrogated and then executed, their heads sent back to their former comrades as silent messages, while Roman deserters caught by their own were flogged, branded, and crucified before the eyes of the army. When final resistance collapsed and the terms of peace were dictated entirely by Rome, the Parthians, forced to cede control of contested territories and endure the humiliation of Rome's authority, pressed into their borders. But Marcus knew it was a victory soaked in too much blood. For though the empire stood triumphant, the disease brought home by the survivors would spread like a shadow over the empire, and the brutality that had secured Rome's eastern dominance would come to define the opening years of his reign. The Parthian War was not just a clash of armies, it was a slow, grinding storm of betrayal, scorched earth, and unflinching violence, one that left the East smoldering under the weight of Rome's wrath and marked Marcus Aurelius not as a philosopher in these moments, but as a ruler who understood that peace was written only in the language of conquest and enforced by the terror of those who survived to remember it. Chapter 2. The Price of Victory. The victory over Parthia was soaked in so much blood and shadowed by so much treachery that even as Rome's banners flew over the conquered east, the empire itself began to rot from within. For the soldiers returning from Ctesiphon and Seleucia did not march home carrying only plunder. They carried death, an invisible plague born in the burning streets of Parthia, carried in the lungs of men who had waded through the filth of ruined cities and the corpses of the unburied. As these legions crossed back into Syria, Anatolia, and then into the heartlands of the empire, they left behind not just stories of their ruthless triumph, but a trail of sickness that struck down civilians and soldiers alike, emptying markets, turning bustling towns into ghostly husks, and forcing Marcus Aurelius to watch as the price of his Eastern war began to strip Rome of its strength before his eyes. But there was no rest, for the smoke of war rose again, this time from the north, where the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other tribes, emboldened by Rome's distraction in the east, poured across the Danube frontier in vast numbers, slaughtering garrisons, burning cities, and even pushing into Italy itself, a violation so rare and humiliating that the panic it caused reached the steps of the Senate. Marcus knew the only way to restore Rome's dignity was to answer with overwhelming force, and so the legions, many weakened by plague, were recalled to the Danube, where they found themselves in a different kind of war, one not fought under the open skies of the desert, but in thick forests, frozen rivers, and mud that swallowed men whole. Here, betrayal wore many faces. For some Roman allies in the north, tribes paid to keep the peace, turned against the empire, raiding Roman supply lines, murdering messengers, and selling captured soldiers to the enemy for a handful of silver, and Marcus responded with unrelenting brutality. Whole communities suspected of treachery were surrounded, their leaders executed, their warriors crucified along the riverbanks as a warning to others. The progress of this war was measured not in sweeping victories, but in slow, savage campaigns, where Roman soldiers fought to take one hill, one fort, one river crossing, often losing more men to frostbite and hunger than to enemy swords. Yet every step forward was followed by destruction. Villages burned to the ground, harvests stolen or destroyed, and survivors driven in chains back across the Danube to serve as slaves in the empire's interior. Marcus's generals knew that fear was as important as steel in breaking the northern tribes, and so they unleashed terror with calculated precision, driving prisoners ahead of the army to act as human shields, impaling captured scouts on stakes where their comrades would see them, and spreading false rumors of massacres to sap the enemy's will before the next assault. Still, the tribes fought fiercely, ambushing Roman patrols, vanishing into the forests, and reappearing miles away to strike at isolated outposts, forcing Marcus to fortify the frontier with a chain of strongholds and garrisons, each a grim reminder that the emperor's so-called philosophy had no place in the realities of war. The brutality deepened when a Roman detachment, lured into a feigned retreat by the Quadi, was surrounded and annihilated, their bodies desecrated and left for the carrion birds, an act that drew such fury from Marcus that he ordered entire Quadi settlements destroyed without distinction between warriors and children, declaring that mercy had no place where betrayal had taken root. This was a war that devoured both sides, for even when Rome's armies pushed the Marcomanni and their allies back across the Danube, there was no peace. Marcus refused to negotiate until the tribes were broken entirely, and so the campaigns continued year after year, a grind of sieges, skirmishes, and retaliations that left the northern frontier littered with burnt villages and mass graves. And yet, as the emperor stood among the frozen corpses of the enemy and the rotting remains of his own men, he must have known that the price of victory was already being paid in coin Rome could not replace. Its armies thinned by disease, its economy strained by constant campaigning, and its provinces restless under the weight of endless recruitment and taxation. Still, Marcus pressed on, for in his mind, the only alternative to this costly war was the slow death of Roman authority. And so he allowed the cycle of blood to spin unchecked, knowing that the empire's survival would be secured not by treaties, but by the memory of what happened to those who defied its legions. And thus, the second great chapter of his reign was written not in the marble of triumphal arches, but in the ashes of the Danube frontier, where the snow was forever stained red and the wind carried the echoes of screams that would haunt Rome long after the emperor was gone. Error Chapter 3. Shadows over the Danube. The forests along the Danube were no silent wilderness. They were traps waiting to close on Rome's legions, places where every shadow could hide a spear, and every fallen tree could be the work of enemy saboteurs, for the Marcomanni and Quadi knew their land like a blade knows its sheath, and they used it to spill Roman blood in ambushes so sudden and savage that whole cohorts vanished without a cry. In this hostile land, progress was measured in bodies, not miles, and Marcus Aurelius understood that only through the methodical destruction of his enemies could he hope to secure the frontier. So the war began with a policy as cold as the northern winters. Every tribe that resisted would be annihilated. Every village that harbored warriors would be burned, and every suspected ally of the enemy would be nailed to Roman crosses along the riverbanks. Yet even as the legions pushed deeper into enemy territory, betrayal gnawed at Rome's flanks. For there were tribes who had sworn loyalty to the empire but now struck in the night, torching Roman outposts and cutting down supply convoys before fading back into the forests, forcing Marcus to wage a second war against those he had once counted as friends. When a captured chieftain confessed under torture that Roman deserters had been training enemy warriors in siegecraft, the punishment was swift. Every deserter found was branded as a traitor and crucified, their bodies left to rot in the open so that no soldier could forget the price of treachery. Still, the tribes fought with a ferocity that shocked even hardened veterans of the Parthian campaigns, attacking not in grand armies but in swarming bands, striking from every direction and melting away before Rome's formations could turn to face them, a style of war that bled the legions with 1,000 small cuts. Marcus countered with relentless brutality, ordering his generals to hunt the tribes without rest, the woods' food stores, livestock wells, become a slow death. Progress came at the cost of unimaginable hardship. Men froze to death on sentry duty, their armor crusted with ice, while others lost fingers and toes to frostbite. Yet the emperor's orders never wavered, for he knew that the enemy would interpret any sign of weakness as an invitation to strike again. One of the darkest moments came when the Roman army surrounded a Quadi settlement, suspected of harboring a war council. Inside were warriors, elders, women, and children, and Marcus ordered the gates sealed and the entire population burned alive, a message that spread like fire through the region, sowing terror even among tribes not yet at war. The campaign reached a fever pitch when the Marcomanni, driven by desperation, attempted to cross the Danube in force, dragging crude rafts through the freezing waters under a hail of Roman arrows, only to be cut down on the far bank and hunted like animals through the marshes, their corpses piling so high that the river itself ran the sluggish with blood. And yet even this slaughter did not end the resistance, for pockets of fighters continued to harass the legions, ambushing scouts, killing messengers, and even attempting to assassinate Roman commanders in their tents. Marcus responded by creating death squads of his own, elite detachments tasked with tracking enemy leaders and killing them in their sleep, leaving their severed heads outside tribal encampments to break the will of the survivors. These tactics, brutal as they were, began to turn the tide, forcing some tribes to sue for peace. But Marcus was not quick to grant it. He demanded hostages, tribute, and the right to station Roman garrisons inside their lands, knowing that only constant surveillance could keep the north quiet. Still, the emperor's eyes were fixed on those who had yet to bend the knee, and so the legions marched ever deeper into hostile ground, each step a gamble against ambush, each night a test of vigilance, and each victory paid for in lives that Rome could ill afford to lose. By the end of this phase of the war, the Danube frontier was littered with the wreckage of villages, the skeletal remains of the unburied, and the broken weapons of both Rome and her enemies. And though the emperor could claim progress, the truth was that the north was not pacified. It was merely too exhausted to fight, a fragile calm that could shatter with the first spark, a reality Marcus understood all too well as he prepared for the next storm. Chapter 4. Carnuntum burns. The city of Carnuntum, once a thriving hub of trade and military strength on the Roman frontier, had become a charred skeleton of stone and ash, its smoking ruins a testament to the ferocity of the war that raged along the Danube. For the Marcomanni had struck without warning, overwhelming its defenders and putting it to the torch before melting back into the forests, leaving behind only corpses sprawled in the streets and the stench of destruction. Marcus Aurelius, upon hearing of the disaster, knew that such an insult could not go unanswered. And so he unleashed a campaign of vengeance so uncompromising that the very land would carry the memory of Rome's wrath, beginning with the relentless pursuit of the raiders responsible, chasing them through swamps and winter ice until they were cornered, bound, and executed in full view of their allies, their heads impaled on stakes along the roads leading to the smoking remains of Carnuntum. But the emperor's fury was not satisfied with retribution alone. He turned the destruction into an example, ordering that any settlement, even suspected of aiding the Marcomanni, be razed to the ground, its inhabitants slaughtered or sold into slavery, its fields salted so that nothing could grow, a policy that spread terror deeper into enemy territory than any legion could march. Betrayal once again reared its head as some of Rome's auxiliary forces, made up of conscripted barbarians, deserted their posts to join their kinsmen in the north, carrying with them knowledge of Roman movements, fortifications, and supply lines, a treachery Marcus punished with merciless efficiency by executing not only the deserters, but also any families left behind under Roman control, ensuring that the stain of disloyalty would be burned out by fear. The progress of the war now became a grim rhythm of advance, destroy, and advance again. Roman legions rebuilt forts destroyed by the enemy, only to see them attacked again in daring night raids, forcing the emperor to adopt harsher defensive measures, including the execution of commanders whose garrisons fell under their watch. When the campaign pushed into the heart of Marcomanni lands, the legions faced a landscape already stripped bare by the fleeing tribes, who burned their own villages and poisoned their own wells rather than let Rome take them. But Marcus turned even this desperation into a weapon by hunting the displaced survivors, cutting down the warriors and forcing the rest into chains to be marched south into the empire as living proof of his dominance. One winter saw the legions trapped in a blizzard for weeks, their supplies dwindling, yet Marcus refused to retreat, ordering that they live off the land by seizing whatever could be taken from nearby tribes, a tactic that starved entire communities but kept the Roman war machine moving forward. When a captured Marcomanni leader attempted to negotiate for his people's survival, Marcus feigned interest only to use the talks as a distraction while his forces surrounded and annihilated the leader's camp, killing every warrior and enslaving the women and children, an act that sent waves of fear across the frontier. The brutality escalated when Roman scouts discovered an enemy refuge hidden deep in the forest, where warriors, elders, and children had gathered in the belief that the terrain would protect them. Marcus ordered the forest set alight, and the fire consumed all within, their screams carried on the wind as a warning to those still resisting. The Danube itself became a barrier of death, with Roman patrols killing anyone found attempting to cross without imperial sanction, their bodies left to drift downstream as grim messages to the tribes. Carnuntum, once the victim, now became the spearhead of Rome's northern operations. Rebuilt not for trade but as a fortress of war, its streets filled with soldiers and siege engines, its gates flanked by the rotting remains of executed prisoners, a constant reminder of the cost of defying Rome. Yet for all the progress made, Marcus knew the war was far from over, for the Marcomanni and their allies still roamed in scattered warbands, striking at supply lines, murdering isolated patrols, and vanishing before a counterattack could be mounted. And so he kept his armies in the field, winter or summer, determined to grind the enemy into dust through attrition and terror. By the close of this phase of the campaign, the lands north of the Danube were scarred by fire, littered with unburied dead, and stripped of resources, the people either dead, enslaved, or too broken to rise again quickly. But Marcus Aurelius, ever the relentless strategist, saw only the necessity of pressing on, for he knew that in war, a single moment of leniency could undo years of bloodshed, and Carnuntum's fate had shown him the price of allowing the enemy to breathe. Chapter 5, The Rain Miracle and Ruthless Advance. Before the story of the so-called rain miracle was told to Roman crowds as a sign of divine favor, its reality was steeped in mud, blood, and terror, for the miracle that the empire celebrated began not with heavenly mercy, but with the near collapse of an entire legion, trapped deep in enemy territory, surrounded by Quadi warriors who had cut them off from food, water, and escape, baking them under a merciless sun until the soldiers' tongues swelled and their strength began to fail. And Marcus Aurelius, learning of their plight, ordered a desperate push to break the siege, knowing full well that the price would be measured in corpses. The attack was a frenzied gamble, with cohorts charging uphill against a wall of enemy spears while archers rained shafts from the trees, the clash so brutal that the ground was slick with blood. Yet in the chaos, a sudden storm rolled over the battlefield, pouring rain onto the parched Romans and sending lightning crashing into the enemy ranks, killing warriors and scattering their formations. And while the emperor's propaganda claimed this was the work of Jupiter or the Christian god, Marcus himself likely saw it as pure fortune, for he wasted no time in turning the soaked, reinvigorated legion into an engine of slaughter, driving them through the fleeing Quadi and cutting them down without mercy. From that moment, the campaign became an unstoppable wave of vengeance, the Romans pushing deeper into Quadi territory, burning villages, executing chiefs, and taking hostages to break the enemy's spirit. But brutality was not reserved for the battlefield alone, for Marcus had learned that certain Quadi leaders had once pledged loyalty to Rome only to betray it when the empire was most distracted. And for such treachery, there was no forgiveness. Entire settlements suspected of collusion were wiped out, their people enslaved or nailed to crude crosses as warnings, their fields torched so that famine would finish what the legions began. Rome's advance was methodical. Each conquered stronghold turned into a forward base, each base marked by the grisly display of severed heads lining the approach roads, each head a silent reminder that resistance meant extinction. And yet the enemy fought on, slipping between the cracks of Rome's advance, striking supply lines, bribing disloyal auxiliaries, and even sending assassins to target Roman commanders. One such attempt nearly killing a senior tribune before the would-be killer was caught and executed by being buried alive alongside his own weapons. Marcus, unmoved by pleas for clemency, saw in these acts proof that no agreement could be trusted, no treaty honored unless enforced at sword point, and thus he abandoned all pretense of negotiation, ordering his forces to raze any village that could serve as a refuge to the Quadi, even if it meant killing innocents to deny the enemy shelter. As the legions marched, they left behind a wasteland, rivers choked with corpses, and roads littered with the bodies of those who had dared flee the oncoming storm. And when the Quadi tried to regroup in the mountains, Rome followed them, hauling siege engines up rocky slopes, starving them out, and offering no quarter when they finally surrendered. Among the darker acts of this campaign was the systematic hunting down of defectors, men who had once served in Rome's own ranks but had turned against it, and Marcus decreed that such traitors should be made examples of, having them paraded in chains before their former comrades and then executed in ways meant to inspire fear, from being thrown to wild beasts in front of the army to being slowly strangled on the battlefield. The emperor also sanctioned the use of captured enemies as human shields during sieges, a tactic that broke enemy morale but left an enduring stain on the campaign's memory. By the time the Quadi had been driven from their strongholds and their resistance shattered, their land was unrecognizable. Forests burned to stumps, farmlands churned into mud by the trampling of armies, and the air thick with the smell of rot and smoke. And yet Marcus did not stop, for his vision was not merely to punish, but to utterly reshape the frontier so that no enemy could rise there again for a generation. The rain that had once been hailed as divine salvation now seemed a distant echo, drowned out by the screams of the dying and the crackle of flames devouring what remained of a proud people. And in the private councils of his generals, Marcus admitted that victory in this war would not be remembered for honor or glory, but for the merciless efficiency with which Rome had erased its foes. Leaving behind a silence so complete, it was as if the Quadi had never existed at all. Chapter 6. Betrayal in the North. The war in the northern front reached a turning point when news arrived that Rome's own allies, tribes who had sworn oaths of loyalty and taken Roman gold, had turned against the empire in secret, feeding intelligence to the enemy, guiding raiding parties through hidden passes, and even attacking Roman supply columns in the dead of night. And Marcus Aurelius, upon discovering this treachery, unleashed a campaign so merciless that even his closest advisors whispered of its cruelty, for his orders were clear. Betrayal was to be answered not with measured punishment, but with utter destruction. And so entire villages that had once been under Roman protection were stormed at dawn, their warriors cut down before they could reach their weapons, their women and children dragged away in chains, and their chieftains subjected to executions so slow and public that they became living symbols of Rome's wrath. The emperor made sure that the first move in this phase of the war was the eradication of every potential traitor's base, sending columns of legionaries deep into allied territories that had secretly turned hostile, burning grain stores, poisoning wells, and slaughtering livestock so no rebel could find sustenance. And these actions, though brutal, shattered the confidence of enemy sympathizers who realized too late that Rome's reach was longer than they had imagined. Yet the enemy grew bolder in their desperation, coordinating with defected Roman auxiliaries who had once fought alongside the legions and now used their knowledge of Roman tactics to stage ambushes, one of which wiped out an entire cohort before reinforcements could arrive. Their mutilated bodies left on display as a taunt to Roman forces, but this act only fueled Marcus's determination to crush them, leading him to authorize retaliation so severe that captured warriors were not simply executed, but dismembered, their remains scattered along the roads as grim markers for the next Roman advance. In this dark chapter of the campaign, Marcus's forces employed methods meant to terrify as much as destroy, setting fire to forests to flush out hiding bands, catapulting the heads of slain chieftains into enemy camps at night, and forcing prisoners to march ahead of siege engines so that their own kin would hesitate to attack. The brutality extended even to supposed peace talks, for when a group of envoys from one of the treacherous tribes came to negotiate, they were seized, stripped of their weapons, and crucified outside their own settlement as the legions stormed in. The settlement's defenders thrown into pits where starving dogs were loosed upon them. Rome's engineers built makeshift fortifications at lightning speed, turning captured enemy villages into staging points for the next assault, and from these bases they launched relentless raids, taking no prisoners unless they could be used as leverage to force further surrenders. It was during this campaign that Marcus revealed one of his darker strategic secrets. Rather than always engaging in open battle, his legions would sometimes leave a path seemingly unguarded, allowing enemy forces to slip through, only to trap them in narrow valleys or on frozen rivers where archers and artillery awaited, turning the enemy's advance into a slaughter pen. Such tactics broke the will of many northern tribes, but some still fought on with suicidal determination, leading to clashes where neither side expected to live. And after each victory, the Romans would strip the dead of armor and weapons, melting them down to arm new recruits, ensuring that the enemy's own strength was turned against them. When the treacherous tribes were finally brought to heel, Marcus ordered mass deportations, scattering survivors across distant provinces so they could never again unite, and those deemed most dangerous were sent to die in Rome's gladiatorial arenas. Their fates a public spectacle meant to remind the empire that betrayal was not only futile but fatal. By the end of this phase of the war, the northern front was littered with smoking ruins and silent fields. The tribes who had once dared to call themselves Rome's allies now erased from their own lands, their names remembered only in the grim records of the legion scribes, and Marcus Aurelius, though hailed as a protector of the empire, carried with him the knowledge that his victory had been built not only on discipline and strategy, but on the cold calculation that fear and annihilation were the most enduring tools of Roman power. Chapter 7. Ariagesus and the Price on a King's Head. The manhunt for Ariagesus, king of the Quadi, began with a proclamation that sent ripples of fear through every tribe in the north. Marcus Aurelius had placed a price on the king's head, dead or alive, and the reward was so lavish that even Ariagesus's own kinsmen were tempted to betray him. For the emperor had decided that this single man's capture would symbolize the total dominance of Rome over the Quadi. And to achieve this, he unleashed a campaign unlike any other, where the legions were not merely soldiers, but hunters, moving through forests, marshes, and frozen plains with a singular objective: interrogating prisoners with torture until their bodies gave out, dangling captured scouts from trees as warnings, and burning any settlement suspected of sheltering the fugitive king. From the very start of this phase of war, Marcus discarded all pretenses of diplomacy, declaring that no terms would be offered, no safe passage granted, and no mercy shown to those who defied Rome's will, and his orders were enforced with terrifying precision as columns of legionaries struck deep into Quadi territory, destroying bridges to cut off escape routes, damming rivers to flood farmland, and leaving behind fields of salted earth so survivors would have nothing to return to. Betrayals became the lifeblood of this hunt, as rival chieftains, eager to rid themselves of Ariagesus's dominance, sold information to the Romans, but each betrayal was followed by swift retribution against the betrayers themselves. For Marcus would not permit treachery to flourish unchecked, even if it served his aims. And in this way he instilled a climate of paranoia so suffocating that no man could trust his neighbor. Dark secrets of the campaign emerged in the form of night raids where Roman troops, guided by turncoat scouts, descended silently on sleeping villages, binding every man, woman, and child before dragging them away to be used as bargaining chips, and in cases where the king was rumored to be nearby, entire populations were slaughtered to eliminate even the smallest chance of him slipping away. The brutality reached its peak when Marcus ordered the systematic execution of all captured quadi nobles, each one beheaded and their heads mounted on spikes along the main roads. The gruesome display meant to break the tribe's spirit and force Ariogaesus into the open. Yet the king proved elusive, moving constantly under the cover of dense forests, hiding among loyal clans who guarded him with their lives, prompting Marcus to employ a darker strategy still. He began spreading false rumors through the enemy ranks that Ariogaesus had already been captured and executed, hoping to lure the real king into revealing himself to rally his people. And though this deception failed to trap him immediately, it sowed chaos among the Quadi and fractured their coordination in battle. The emperor's forces continued their relentless advance, using scorched earth tactics so thorough that smoke from burning villages was said to hang over the land for weeks, and those Quadi warriors who dared to fight were met with overwhelming force, their bodies left where they fell to rot in the open as a warning. Eventually, the trap closed when Ariogaesus' location was betrayed by one of his own, a man whose family had been taken hostage by the Romans and whose loyalty could no longer outweigh his desperation. And when the king was finally seized, Marcus did not execute him on the battlefield, as some expected, but instead paraded him through the Roman camps in chains, forcing his people to witness their leader's humiliation before sending him into exile in Alexandria, a fate designed to strip him of power while denying him the honor of a warrior's death. The capture of Ariogaesus marked the breaking point for the Quadi, their resistance collapsing as surviving clans either fled into the wilderness or surrendered outright. And in the aftermath, Marcus ordered mass deportations, scattering the remnants of the tribe across distant provinces where they would be absorbed or erased by Roman culture. The roads once guarded by Quadi warriors were now lined with Roman forts, and their sacred groves had been cut down to build siege engines, a final insult to a people who had once prided themselves on their independence. But the emperor's victory was as much psychological as it was physical, for by turning the hunt for a single man into a campaign of terror and total destruction, he had demonstrated that no enemy of Rome, no matter how revered or well protected, could escape the reach of its legions. Chapter 8. Rome's Crushing Grip. The conquest of the defeated tribes began with a policy so cold and methodical that it erased entire cultures in a matter of months. Marcus Aurelius ordered the mass enslavement of tens of thousands of captured men, women, and children, scattering them across the farthest reaches of the empire so they could never again unite. A calculated cruelty meant not only to remove any threat of rebellion, but to wipe away the very memory of their homelands, and this policy was enforced with pitiless efficiency as Roman troops descended on surrendering villages, binding the inhabitants in chains, branding them with iron, and marching them away under armed guard, the weakest falling dead on the roadside and left for the crows. From the outset of this phase of war, scorched earth tactics became the norm, with Marcus commanding his generals to burn every settlement that had once supplied warriors to the enemy, even if it had already submitted, to make an example for others and to ensure that the land itself could no longer sustain a hostile force. And in doing so, the Romans turned once fertile fields into smoking wastelands, poisoned wells and destroyed storehouses, condemning any survivors to slow starvation. Betrayal ran rampant as some tribal leaders, desperate to save their own lives or curry favor, turned over neighboring clans to the Romans. But Marcus made it clear that such treachery would not grant immunity, for these collaborators were often executed once their usefulness ended, their severed heads displayed at the entrances of Roman camps as grim trophies. The darkest secrets of this campaign emerged in the treatment of captured warriors, who were not simply executed, but subjected to days of public torture meant to break the spirit of their comrades still at large, with crucifixions lining the roads and mutilated corpses left hanging for weeks as a warning that resistance brought not death but prolonged suffering. In the Highland, where pockets of resistance still held out, Marcus unleashed his most ruthless commanders with orders to leave no one alive, turning entire valleys into silent graveyards where only the smoke of burned homes marked the existence of what had once been thriving communities. And it was said that the stench of decay clung to the air for miles. The brutality extended beyond the battlefield as Rome deliberately dismantled the social structures of the conquered, executing tribal elders, destroying sacred sites, and forcing surviving youths into auxiliary units of the Roman army where they would be used as expendable frontline troops in distant wars, a fate considered worse than death by many who saw it as the ultimate erasure of their identity. The legions, emboldened by their emperor's uncompromising orders, took to raiding even those settlements that had sworn loyalty to Rome under the pretext of rooting out hidden rebels. And in these raids, entire families were slaughtered in the night without trial or evidence, their homes looted before being set ablaze. Marcus, who had once been hailed as a philosopher king, now presided over a war machine that devoured everything in its path. His personal correspondence to his generals, never meant for public eyes, revealing a chilling pragmatism that valued total domination over any pretense of moral restraint. And though some Roman senators protested the scale of destruction, their voices were drowned out by the flood of wealth, slaves, and land pouring into the empire as a result of his tactics. The rivers that had once served as lifelines for the tribes were now controlled entirely by Rome, with fortified bridges and garrisons ensuring that no movement went unmonitored. And any attempt to cross without permission was met with immediate execution, the bodies tossed into the water to drift downstream as a signal to those watching from the banks. By the end of this brutal campaign, the northern frontier had been transformed into a fortified scar across the landscape, dotted with watchtowers, palisades, and garrisons. And the tribes who had once posed a serious threat were reduced to scattered remnants, too weak and too broken to rise again, their languages fading, their traditions outlawed, and their lands repopulated with settlers loyal to Rome. It was not simply a military victory, but an act of calculated erasure, a campaign designed not only to defeat an enemy, but to ensure they could never again exist as a people. And though Marcus presented this to the Senate as a necessary act for the security of the empire, the reality was far darker, a cold, deliberate program of destruction that transformed the Danube frontier into a graveyard of nations. Chapter 9. The Winter of Blood. The most chilling acts of the northern campaigns began not with a charge or battle cry, but with the quiet, methodical sealing of entire valleys during the brutal winter, when Marcus Aurelius's legions would block every pass en route, trapping whole populations inside as the snow deepened and the food ran out. A tactic calculated to force starvation without spending a single arrow, and those who attempted to flee were cut down on sight, their bodies frozen in the drifts as mute warnings to others. This merciless siege method, though rarely recorded in official histories, became a favored tool for breaking the last resistance of the tribes, and it left behind scenes so grim that even some veterans refused to speak of them, where children were found clinging to the skeletal remains of their mothers. Entire families reduced to bones, gnawed by desperate survivors before they too perished. In the midst of this engineered famine, Rome sent envoys to offer survival in exchange for complete surrender. But these offers were poisoned with betrayal, for the moment leaders emerged from hiding to negotiate. They were seized, paraded before their starving people, and executed as examples of Rome's absolute dominance. Marcus's generals, emboldened by their emperor's willingness to sanction such cruelty, began to compete in devising new ways to crush morale, burning sacred forests, slaughtering livestock in front of the defeated to erase their future means of survival, and forcing prisoners to fight to the death in the snow for the amusement of the troops. These acts were not impulsive outbursts but deliberate policy, as orders preserved in military records instructed commanders to leave no community intact that had ever resisted, and to destroy not just their means of war, but their ability to exist. In the rare battles that winter did not halt, the Romans fought with savage precision, using shield walls to pin the enemy in place, while cavalry swept in from the flanks, spearing those who fled and trampling the wounded under iron-shod hooves, the frozen ground amplifying the sound of dying men until it echoed across the hills. Betrayal was a constant companion to these wars, as some chieftains sought to save themselves by delivering the heads of rival leaders to Rome, only to find that treachery was rewarded with the same fate once their usefulness had passed, their corpses displayed beside those they had betrayed. Prisoners of rank were sometimes kept alive for weeks, paraded between camps as proof of victory, forced to watch their captured warriors tortured and mutilated before being strangled in front of their remaining kin. The darkest of these secrets was the Roman practice of deliberately spreading disease among besieged settlements, sending infected prisoners or contaminated food into enemy territory, a tactic born of desperation during the Antonine Plague, but adapted as a weapon of war, ensuring that even if the defenders drove back an attack, Sickness would finish what the legions had started. As the months dragged on and the snow began to melt, Marcus ordered the final extermination of any survivors who had not sworn loyalty, unleashing mobile units to sweep through the thawing countryside, killing without trial, burning without pause, and leaving smoking ruins where villages had stood for generations. These mopping-up operations were accompanied by mass deportations, with columns of shackled prisoners marched south under guard, many collapsing and dying on the road, their bodies stripped of clothing and left for scavengers, while the strongest were auctioned as slaves to pay for the continuation of the war. By the time the campaign ended, entire tribal identities had been erased, their lands divided among Roman veterans as rewards for service, and the Danube frontier stood not only as a fortified boundary, but as a memorial to calculated annihilation. Marcus presented the campaign to the Senate as a necessary purge to secure the empire's future. But the reality, whispered among soldiers and slaves, was that it had been a winter not of heroism, but of methodical bloodletting, where the cold did not kill as swiftly as the hand of Rome, and where victory was measured not in captured banners or conquered cities, but in how completely a people could be made to disappear from the earth. Chapter 10. The River of Corpses. Before the first swords clashed in the spring offensive, the Romans had already begun shaping the war's outcome through calculated atrocities, the most infamous of which was the deliberate drowning of hundreds of captured warriors in the Danube, their hands bound and stones tied around their necks before being thrown into the cold, rushing water, their bodies later drifting downstream to spread terror among those who still dared to resist. This was not a chaotic massacre, but a planned spectacle, carried out at dawn so that the rising sun illuminated the floating corpses, a vision designed to break the will of enemy scouts who stumbled upon the scene. And the psychological effect was devastating, with some tribes surrendering without a fight, believing Rome's brutality had no limit. The campaign then moved with relentless pace, Marcus Aurelius's legions advancing along the rivers and burning settlements as they went, sparing neither shrines nor storehouses, ensuring that survivors would find only charred earth and poisoned wells when they tried to return. Betrayal was a constant weapon in Rome's arsenal, and the emperor's agents infiltrated enemy ranks with promises of gold and freedom, persuading desperate leaders to betray their allies by revealing hidden supply caches or leading Roman detachments through secret forest paths. Yet once their treachery had served its purpose, these same collaborators were executed in public, their families enslaved, their betrayal punished as a lesson to all who might think treachery could secure them a lasting place in Rome's favor. The fighting was relentless, and in every skirmish the Romans sought not just to defeat, but to humiliate the enemy, cutting off the hands of captured archers, branding the faces of surviving warriors, and forcing them to march ahead of the legions as living shields in the next battle, where arrows from their own people would often cut them down. The legions perfected the art of the ambush that year, feigning retreat into wooded valleys before surrounding their pursuers and cutting them apart in close combat, where the noise of swords on shields and the screams of the wounded echoed until the attackers were reduced to mangled heaps, their armor stripped, their corpses left to rot where they fell. Dark rumors spread that some Roman commanders ordered the mutilation of the dead, severing heads and piling them into pyramids at crossroads as a warning to others. A practice the emperor never publicly acknowledged but never punished, as its effect on morale was undeniable. Whole rivers were said to run red with blood after major clashes, and in one infamous instance, a temporary dam built to control water flow for a siege was deliberately destroyed after battle, washing the unburied bodies of the fallen downstream to the villages below, an act so horrifying that it became known among locals as the day the river screamed. The brutality extended even to Rome's supposed allies. Auxiliary troops from distant provinces who faltered in battle or hesitated to press an attack were flogged, disarmed, and sometimes executed in view of both sides to prove that mercy had no place in Marcus's war. When cities fell, their gates breached by battering rams and fire, the slaughter was indiscriminate. Men, women, and children alike were cut down in the streets, their homes looted and then set ablaze so that the smoke could be seen for miles, a grim signal to other settlements that resistance would bring nothing but ashes. During one siege, the defenders, facing starvation, offered to surrender if allowed to leave with their lives, but Marcus's commanders accepted only to have them walk into a killing field between two lines of Roman troops, where the unarmed were butchered in what the soldiers mockingly called the March of Peace. Disease was still an ever-present weapon, and the Romans sometimes catapulted the corpses of plague victims into besieged towns, knowing the infection would spread faster than their soldiers could, ensuring that even if the walls held, the people inside would not. Prisoners deemed valuable for ransom were subjected to brutal interrogations, tortured until they revealed troop movements or stockpiles, and once their usefulness ended, they were either sold to the lowest bidder or executed in ways designed to entertain the troops, such as being torn apart by teams of horses or thrown into rivers with their armor on. As the campaign progressed, entire regions were depopulated, the survivors driven into slave columns that stretched for miles, guarded by grim-faced soldiers who had long ceased to see them as human. The emperor's reports to the Senate described these victories as the pacification of barbarian lands. But the truth known to the men who fought there was that the war was less about conquest and more about erasing entire cultures, grinding them into the dirt until no trace of their language, gods, or traditions remained. And when the final push of the season came, with the legions advancing deep into enemy territory, their banners snapping in the wind and the air thick with the smell of smoke and blood, it was clear to all that this was no ordinary war. It was a campaign of annihilation, a deliberate transformation of the frontier into a wasteland where only Rome's will could survive. Step into the mud, blood, and madness of Rome's deadliest campaigns. Because if you think history is boring, you clearly haven't watched an emperor crush his enemies, tax the survivors, and still have time to write about virtue. Read on, before the legions come for you next.